The smell of blood and dust still lingers in my memory, sharper than gunpowder after a fight. That day began like any other on the Texas plains, sun blistering overhead, cicadas shrieking in the mesquite, but it ended with me carrying a half-dead girl out of a rotting stable, and into a storm that would change everything I thought I knew about justice, fear, and the weight a man can carry on his soul. I wasn't looking for trouble. I had enough of my own. A rancher in his 50s doesn't get through life without burying a fair share of people he loved, without watching land turn dry and cattle starve. I'd lived through droughts, Indian raids, winters that froze calves in their first breath. But I wasn't ready for what I saw that day out near San Angelo. It started with the flies. You can always tell when death is close by the way flies swarm, thick and relentless, even before the body has gone cold. My horse picked up the scent before I did, ears twitching, nostrils flaring. I followed it, half worried I'd come across a steer carcass left to rot, maybe the work of rustlers. But when I came to that stable on the edge of a forgotten trail, the stench wasn't cattle. It was something worse. The boards of the place leaned like old bones, the roof sagging low. Heat pressed down on the tin, baking the air until it shimmered. I remember stepping inside, and my boots crunching through straw, and that's when I saw her. She couldn't have been more than 23. Tied to a rough post, wrists cut raw by rope that bit straight through her flesh. Her dress, once white, was streaked with dirt and blood, the fabric torn at the shoulder, ripped at the hip. One eye swollen shut, cheek purple from a blow that must have still been burning. She hung there like someone had drained all the fight from her body, and yet, I'll never forget this, her eyes were open, wide, fixed on the doorway, like she'd been waiting for someone, anyone, to step through before it was too late. For a moment, I froze. You live long enough out here, and you think you've seen cruelty in every shape it takes. Lynchings, shootings in saloons over a spilled drink, families starved off their land by greedy men who twisted the law. But this was different. This was deliberate. Not a fight gone too far, not an accident. It was punishment. A message. The girl trembled when I walked closer, her breathing shallow like each breath was borrowed. I could see she'd fought back, knees scraped raw from trying to stand, wrists flayed open from pulling against the ropes, but now she was spent. Finished. I knew right then I was stepping into something bigger than me. A man's gut tells him when trouble's coming, and mine twisted hard. But leaving her there wasn't an option. Not for me. I pulled the knife from my belt, cut her down before her knees gave way. She collapsed into my arms like a newborn foal, her skin burning hot under the relentless Texas sun. I carried her out into the light, and as I lifted her onto my horse, I felt the weight wasn't just her body. It was a storm, heavy and gathering, and now I was standing dead center in its path. Her name, I'd later learn, was Clara Hayes, and though she whispered it weak as a dying flame, there was strength buried in her voice that told me she wasn't broken, not yet. She was the daughter of a rancher up in Wichita County, a man who'd said no to someone who wasn't used to hearing it. That man's name was Grayson, and his kind of no carried consequences. But I didn't know all that yet. All I knew was the girl in my arms had been left to die for reasons rooted deep in greed, and by carrying her away from that stable, I just planted myself in the middle of a fight that was going to cost blood before it was through. The Texas sun dipped lower as we rode, and with each hoofbeat I felt it settle heavier on me. This wasn't a rescue. It was the beginning of a war. I rode hard for my ranch with the girl slumped against me, her head pressed to my chest like she was holding on to the sound of my heartbeat to remind herself she was still alive. The road stretched long, and the sun bled red into the horizon, but I didn't slow. Every mile between that stable and my land felt like I was outrunning more than time. I was outrunning the men who had done this, and the fury they'd bring when they learned she wasn't where they left her. By the time we reached my cabin, The sky had turned the color of burning coals. My ranch sat quiet, the windmill creaking, cattle lowing in the distance. The world looked unchanged, but I knew better. The moment I cut that girl free, the world had shifted under my boots, and there was no undoing it. I carried her inside, my arms stiff from the ride, but unwilling to let her go too soon. The cabin was small, wood smoke, leather, and the faint smell of coffee gone cold, but it was shelter. I laid her gently in the chair by the fire, fetched a tin cup of water from the pump outside, and held it to her lips. She drank like a woman starved, each swallow slow and trembling, but she finished it all. Only then did some of the haze leave her eyes. That was when she found her voice. Faint, broken, but steady enough. She told me her name, Clara Hayes, and that she was the daughter of Henry Hayes, a rancher up in Wichita County whose land stretched wide and green. Land worth fighting for. Land worth killing for. A man named Grayson, she said, had been pressing her father to sell. Grayson was the kind of rich man who wore his power like armor, a man who thought the law bent at his command. Her father had told him no, and men like Grayson didn't take kindly to no. So they came for her, beat her, tied her up like cattle, left her to rot in that stable until her father broke. She was never the end goal, just leverage. I sat silent, jaw locked tight as a post, listening to every word. I'd known men like Grayson my whole life, men who smiled in church pews on Sundays and hired thugs to do their dirty work on Mondays, men who built empires not on sweat, but on fear. I knew also what saving Clara meant. By cutting her free, I had spit in Grayson's face without ever meeting him, and men like that didn't forget. They came for you, and they kept coming until they'd ground you into dust. Still, looking at her across the cabin fire, I couldn't regret it. Her face was pale, one eye swollen, but her spirit hadn't buckled. There was a spark in her eyes, a quiet defiance that told me she wasn't broken yet. And something in me, something I thought had gone cold years ago, stirred. But the night wasn't going to give us peace. I knew that as sure as I knew my land. Out here, the dark carried sounds differently. Coyotes, cattle, the creak of old boards, they all had a rhythm. And when something broke that rhythm, you noticed. I was sitting at the table, rifle laid across my knees, when I heard it. Boots on dirt. Slow, steady. Not my boots, not any ranch hand, because I didn't have any. Just me and the land. I held my breath and waited. The door creaked open, and a shadow filled it. A man. Tall, lean, with a crooked grin carved on his face like he'd worn it too long. His eyes carried no shame. I knew his type. Hired muscle. The kind who asked no questions, only swung fists and tied knots. He leaned against the frame like he owned it, and though Clara stiffened in the chair, I didn't need her gasp to tell me he was one of them. One of Grayson's men. I didn't reach for words. Out here, words are as empty as a dry well when a man comes to take something from you. My hand rested steady on the Colt laid across the table, and we just stared at one another, silence thick as thunderclouds. What happened next wasn't clean. It wasn't pretty. But it was necessary. When a man steps into your home with the intent to drag a half-dead girl back into the hands of the devil who sent him, you don't hesitate. You don't wait. By the time I had him pinned against the wall, breath leaking out of him in short bursts, I knew my life had shifted again. A packet of bills fell from his coat, stamped with the mark of Wichita County Bank. Money that reeked of Grayson's pockets. I didn't need a judge to tell me the truth. Clara's story was real, and now the proof lay crumpled at my feet. The man squirmed, but I pressed harder, and in that moment I understood something I hadn't in a long time. I wasn't just fighting for my land anymore. I was fighting because cruelty like this needed a line drawn against it. And whether I liked it or not, I was the man standing on that line. I dragged him out into the dirt, tied him to a post until I figured what to do with him. The night grew too quiet after that, and the stars above looked colder than usual. Clara sat inside, staring at the floor, her face pale but her spirit still steady. I knew then this wasn't going to end with one man tied up outside my cabin. Grayson's reach stretched far, and men like him didn't stop. They gathered more. They pressed harder. They burned what they couldn't buy. And as I sat by the fire, rifle close, the girl dozing in the chair, I heard something else. Not just one horse this time. Several. Distant, but closing. The storm was already on my doorstep, and I was about to learn what it meant to defy a man who thought he owned Texas itself. The hours before dawn are the cruelest time in Texas. The land holds its breath, the air heavy, and even the coyotes seem to wait for something unseen. That night, I didn't close my eyes. I sat by the window with a rifle across my knees, watching the thin line of the horizon, knowing the sound I'd heard wasn't a trick. Hooves. More than one horse, drawing closer with every heartbeat. Clara dozed in the chair, her head tilted against the wall, skin pale from fever and strain. She looked fragile in the firelight, like a flame that could gutter out with a wrong breath of wind. But I'd seen the way her eyes burned when she spoke of Grayson, the way she clenched her jaw when she mentioned her father's name. Fragile wasn't the right word. She was battered, yes, but somewhere inside her, something unyielding remained. When the sound came again, closer, heavier, I stood and chambered around. Clara stirred, opening her one good eye, and she knew without me saying a word. Trouble was here. The first glow of dawn bled across the plains when I stepped onto the porch. 3 riders came into view, their horses kicking up dust, their shapes tall and broad against the rising sun. They rode with a swagger that didn't come from skill. It came from fear, the kind men like them had carved into others for too long. They dismounted, boots crunching hard against the dirt, and each carried more than pistols. Torches. Cans of kerosene. Tools meant to turn a man's home into nothing but ash. One of them called out, his voice carrying sharp in the morning stillness. He told me plain, hand over the girl, or the ranch goes up in flames. No bargaining, no mercy, just a threat hung heavy in the air. I raised my rifle and answered without words. Out here, silence speaks louder than any man's mouth. My shadow stretched long across the porch, and I let them see the set of my jaw, the steadiness in my hands. This was my land, my home. It wasn't theirs to take. The standoff dragged like thunder on the horizon. Each second tightened the air, until finally it snapped. A torch sailed through the air, landing against a pile of hay near the barn. The flames licked up fast, greedily. Clara, without hesitation, grabbed a bucket of water and dashed it across the fire. She moved stiff and slow from her injuries, but her spirit cut through the pain. In that same instant, I squeezed the trigger. The first rider dropped, his torch falling from his hand as his horse reared in panic. The second lunged forward, pistol flashing, but years of ranch work had given me strength and steadiness. I pivoted, fired again, and he crumpled into the dirt. The third scrambled, torch still in hand, but Clara was faster than fear. She snatched a wooden beam leaning by the porch and hurled it at his horse's legs. The animal reared violently, throwing its rider into the dust. He scrambled, cursing, before stumbling into the brush, swearing vengeance as he fled. The fight was over as quickly as it began, but the aftermath settled heavy. The smell of gunpowder hung bitter in the air, mixing with the faint char of burned hay. Two men lay groaning in the dirt, their faces twisted with pain and fury. Another was gone, but not for good. Clara leaned against the porch rail, chest heaving, her eyes wide not with fear, but with something fiercer. She had tasted her own strength in that moment, even if her body trembled from exhaustion. I looked down at the two wounded men and knew the truth. This wasn't victory. This was only the opening shot. Grayson would hear of it before the sun climbed high. Word would spread, and when it reached his ears, he'd send more. More men. More fire. Maybe even the law twisted to his liking. Still, I didn't regret it. Not for a heartbeat. This was my home, and she was under my roof. A man who won't defend either doesn't deserve to call himself a man. I bound the two survivors tight with rope, dragging them against the barn wall where the shade might keep them alive until I decided what to do. Their eyes glared up at me with hate, but behind it I caught a flicker of fear. They weren't used to being bested. They were used to people bowing their heads when Grayson's name was spoken. Not here. Not today. When I stepped back into the cabin, Clara sat at the table, her hands shaking but her chin held high. She didn't look at me like a savior. She looked at me like an equal, like someone who had chosen the same fight she had, even if neither of us had wanted it. The sun climbed higher, burning hot against the land. I knew before long the town would hear. Every gunshot carries farther than you think in Texas. Every rider who flees spreads word quicker than a telegraph line. By noon, Grayson would know. And when he knew, the storm would no longer be crawling toward us. It would come roaring. That night, as Clara dozed near the fire, I sat awake, the rifle close, staring out at the horizon. The men tied outside moaned in their ropes, but my mind was already beyond them. I thought of Clara's father, Henry Hayes, holding on to land Grayson wanted badly enough to tear a girl apart for. I thought of what it meant that I had stepped in the middle, and I thought of the fire I hadn't felt in years, burning again in my chest. The fight wasn't about me anymore. It wasn't just about Clara. It wasn't even about one rancher's land. It was about every man, woman, and child who'd been bent under Grayson's shadow, too afraid to rise. The Texas plains had a way of swallowing men's stories. But some stories didn't stay buried. Some burned bright enough to catch, and spread, and set the whole land alight. And I knew, come dawn, ours would be one of them. By morning, the decision was made. Leaving those men tied to my barn post would have been the easier path, but it wouldn't have been the right one. If I wanted the truth to spread, if I wanted proof of what Grayson had done to weigh heavier than his money, then the people of town needed to see it for themselves. I saddled the wagon just after sunup. Clara, still pale from the fever of her wounds, insisted she come along. She could barely stand without bracing on the chair, but there was no mistaking the fire in her eyes. She wasn't about to be left behind, not when the men who had done this to her might face the light of day for the first time. So we loaded the wagon. The two wounded men groaned as I heaved them onto the boards, their wrists bound, their eyes sharp with hate but dulled by blood loss. I tied them firm, tighter than any steer rope I'd knotted in my life. Then Clara climbed carefully into the seat beside me. The sun was barely climbing when the wagon wheels cracked against the dirt road and we set off toward town. The ride was long, the kind that carves silence between two people, but I could feel Clara's strength return mile by mile. She sat upright, her good eye fixed on the horizon, her torn dress pulled together with what little dignity she had left. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was becoming something else, a witness, maybe even a spark. When we rolled into town, the sound of the wagon drew eyes quick. Folks in San Angelo knew the rhythm of a normal day, the blacksmith's hammer, the chatter outside the general store, the clop of hooves. But a wagon carrying two bloodied men bound like criminals? That broke the rhythm. Heads turned. Voices hushed. By the time I pulled up in front of the sheriff's office, a small crowd had already gathered. Men with dust still clinging to their trousers from the fields, women clutching their shawls tighter around their shoulders, children peeking wide-eyed from behind their mothers' skirts. I climbed down first, then hauled the prisoners off one by one, dragging them into the dirt where the townsfolk could see their faces. They spat curses, tried to twist away, but I held them fast. When the bundle of bills tumbled from one man's coat pocket, stamped with the mark of Wichita County Bank, a ripple ran through the crowd. Whispers turned sharper. Names hissed. Everyone knew whose money that was. Clara stepped down from the wagon, her knees trembling but her head held high. For a moment, the whole street seemed to stop. People saw her swollen eye, her torn dress, the rope burns still raw on her wrists. They saw what had been done to her, and in that silence you could feel something shifting. The sheriff came out at last, his face pale under the brim of his hat. He was a decent enough man, but like most, he'd learned to look the other way when Grayson's shadow fell over him. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, one of the prisoners spat Grayson's name, cursing him for leaving them behind. That was all it took. The last wall of silence cracked. A storekeeper stepped forward, voice trembling but loud enough for all to hear. He spoke of how Grayson had bled him near to ruin with crooked debts. Then a widow shouted from the back, how Grayson's men had driven her off her land when her husband died. Each word was like a stone dropped in a pond, ripples spreading fast. More voices rose. More stories spilled out. 4 years, the town had carried its fear like a yoke, but fear breaks when enough hands lift it together. I stood silent through it all, Clara at my side, her face pale but her eyes burning bright. She was no longer just Henry Hayes's daughter. She was proof of Grayson's cruelty, standing flesh and blood in the middle of San Angelo. The sheriff looked around, his jaw tight, his eyes shifting between me, the prisoners, and the growing crowd. I could see the weight pressing down on him. He had lived too long under Grayson's money to stand tall without shaking. But even he couldn't deny the proof at his feet or the fire catching in the townsfolk's eyes. By noon, the whole street buzzed with talk. Grayson's name no longer carried only fear, it carried anger. And anger is more dangerous to men like him than bullets. I hitched the wagon again and prepared to leave, Clara climbing back into the seat beside me. The crowd parted as we rolled forward, and in the hush I caught something in their faces. Not just curiosity, not just pity, but hope, raw and dangerous. That was when I realized something that made my gut twist harder than any fight. This wasn't just my burden anymore. By dragging those men into town, I hadn't just exposed the truth. I'd lit a fuse. And when that fuse reached Grayson, there'd be no stopping the fire. That night, as we rode back toward my ranch, Clara's voice finally broke the silence between us. She didn't ask what would come next. She didn't plead for safety. She only said one thing, quiet but strong, that her father would never bend, and neither would she. The plains stretched wide before us, the stars coming alive in the dark sky. I gripped the reins tighter, knowing full well what her words meant. This wasn't just Clara's fight, wasn't just Henry Hayes's fight. It had become mine, and before it was over, it would become the town's too. Fear is a stubborn thing. It doesn't vanish overnight, not even when truth is laid bare in the middle of a crowded street. But I could feel it shifting in town that day, turning into something heavier. Anger. And anger, once sparked, spreads faster than prairie fire. Grayson would hear of it. I knew that before Clara and I even left San Angelo. He'd hear about the prisoners tied up, the money stamped with his bank, the voices that finally dared to speak his name with fury instead of silence. He'd hear, and he wouldn't sit quiet in his fine house on the hill. Men like him never do. They strike fast and hard, to remind everyone why fear is safer than hope. We rode back to my ranch under a wide Texas sky, the wagon wheels groaning against the dirt. Clara sat beside me, her face pale but set, her good eye fixed ahead as if she, too, knew the storm was coming. Neither of us spoke much. Some truths don't need words. By the time we rolled through my gate, dusk was falling. The horizon burned red, and the land felt too quiet, like even the coyotes had gone to ground. I unloaded the wagon slow, every sound sharp in the stillness. Clara limped inside, carrying herself with more pride than strength, and I set about checking my rifle, counting what little ammunition I had. Night fell heavy, and I tried to rest, but sleep wouldn't come. My hands itched against the stock of the rifle, ears straining for sounds I prayed I wouldn't hear. The prisoners I'd dragged into town had loosened Grayson's hold, but they'd also lit a fire under his rage. He'd strike back. It was only a question of when. The answer came just past midnight. The first sound was hooves. Not 2 or 3 this time, but a dozen at least. Horses pounding the earth, rolling like thunder through the dark. My chest went tight, and I moved to the window. Dust clouded under the moonlight, and shadows emerged, riders armed and carrying torches that glowed like angry stars. I shook Clara awake, her body weak but her spirit sharper than any blade. She saw the fire outside, the shapes of men, and she didn't flinch. She simply rose, steadying herself against the chair, and nodded. She was ready, in her own way. The first torch arced through the air before I could even shout. It crashed against the barn wall, flames clawing up the dry wood. Another followed, landing near the fence line. They weren't here to take prisoners. They were here to burn everything I owned to ash, and drag Clara through the embers back to their master. I lifted the rifle, steadied my breath, and fired. The first rider toppled from his saddle, his torch tumbling into the dirt. Another lunged forward, pistol blazing, but Clara was quicker than fear. She grabbed the water bucket we kept by the door and dashed it over the barn fire before it could spread. The fight that followed wasn't measured in minutes. It was measured in heartbeats, in muzzle flashes, in the screams of horses and the crash of boots against dry earth. I moved like a man half my age, every shot placed with the calm of someone who knew hesitation meant death. One rider spun and fell. Another staggered back, clutching his side, before disappearing into the night. But they kept coming. Torches flew. Bullets bit into the walls of my cabin. The smell of kerosene mixed with smoke until it choked the air. Clara, though battered and bruised, didn't cower. She carried water, doused flames, even shoved a burning torch back through the window at one man who tried to climb in. Her defiance burned hotter than any fire they set. At last, as the first grey light of dawn broke across the plains, the fight thinned. 2 riders lay still in the dirt, another crawled away into the brush, bleeding and swearing vengeance. The rest scattered, their torches dropped, their courage spent. I stood on the porch, chest heaving, the rifle still warm in my hands. Smoke curled from the barn roof, but the flames had been beaten back. My land still stood. Clara still breathed, and I was still alive. But victory didn't feel like victory. Not when I looked across the yard and saw the blood soaking into the soil, the smoke rising in the pale morning light. This was only the beginning. Grayson hadn't come himself. He'd sent his dogs, and dogs can always be replaced. Clara leaned against the porch rail, her hair tangled, her skin smeared with ash and sweat. She looked at me then, not with fear, but with something deeper, a silent understanding. We had faced the storm and stood our ground, but the storm wasn't done. It was only gathering. I knew what had to be done. Waiting here for Grayson to send more men was a death sentence. If this was going to end, it wouldn't be on my ranch alone. It would have to end where his power lived, in town, in the hearts of the people he'd crushed under his boot. For years, folks had whispered about Grayson, cursed his name behind closed doors, but bent their backs in daylight. Now the whispers were louder. Now the fear was cracked. All it needed was one more push, one more spark to turn those whispers into a roar. I looked at Clara, her eyes fierce despite the bruises, and I saw that spark staring back at me. The time had come to ride not for my land alone, but for every soul who had been bent by Grayson's greed. The fight was no longer at my doorstep. It was heading straight for his. And I swore to myself, as the sun climbed over the Texas horizon, that when it came, I would be ready. Dawn burned across the plains, but it wasn't a peaceful light. Smoke still rose from the barn roof, the yard littered with the aftermath of the night's siege. I stood at the edge of my porch, rifle across my knees, staring out over the blood-soaked dirt. The silence after a battle is never clean. It hangs heavy, like the world is waiting to see if you'll fall with the dead or stand among the living. Clara sat just inside the doorway, wrapped in a blanket, her body weak but her eyes sharp. She hadn't slept. Neither had I. Neither could. Grayson's men had failed to burn me out, but failure wasn't something their master tolerated. He would strike harder, and next time he wouldn't settle for shadows in the night. "We can't stay here," Clara said, her voice rough but steady. "You know that." I did. The ranch was my blood and sweat, every fence post and beam built with my own 2 hands, but land is nothing when you're too dead to hold it. If we stayed, Grayson would come back with 20 men instead of 10, and no rifle in Texas could hold against that. But running wasn't the answer either. If we vanished into the dust, Grayson's power would stretch unbroken, the people of San Angelo would sink back into silence, and Clara's suffering would be nothing more than another shadow no one dared name. The only way forward was through him. By midday, I had the horses saddled. Clara climbed into the saddle with a grit that outshone her pain, refusing to be left behind. She rode with her father's steel in her spine, and I knew in that moment she'd stand beside me to the end, no matter the cost. The ride to town was long and hot, the sun beating down like judgment. Every mile closer tightened the knot in my chest. I wasn't a man who stirred trouble, but today I was carrying it in plain view, and the people of San Angelo would have to choose, silence or rebellion. When we rode down Main Street, the town went still. Boots froze on wooden planks, voices cut short mid-sentence. Folks saw the rifles slung across our backs, the soot on our clothes, the blood that hadn't been washed clean. They didn't ask questions because they already knew the answers. I dismounted in front of the sheriff's office, and Clara followed, her steps slow but proud. The sheriff himself stepped out, his face pale as parchment. He looked at us like we were ghosts risen from the grave. "Grayson's men came for us last night," I said, loud enough for the street to hear. My voice carried sharp, like the crack of a whip. "They set fire to my land, tried to drag this girl back to their master. They failed. But they'll come again. And next time, it won't be just my ranch. It'll be this whole town." The words fell like stones in still water. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some lowered their eyes. Others clenched their fists. Fear wrestled with anger in every face I saw. Clara stepped forward then, her voice softer than mine but carrying further somehow. "They thought they could break me, thought they could break all of us. But they're wrong. I saw my father fight them, and I'll fight them too. But none of us can stand alone." Her words struck like a hammer on iron. For a moment, silence held, heavy as a hanging rope. Then an old rancher stepped forward. His back was bent, his hands twisted with years of labor, but his eyes burned with something that hadn't been there before. "I've had my fill of that bastard's boots on my neck," he said. "If Elias is willing to stand, I'll stand too." More voices followed. A widow clutching her son's hand. A blacksmith with soot still on his face. The storekeeper who'd once whispered about crooked debts now spoke them aloud. The fire spread. One by one, the townsfolk began to straighten their backs, to speak their anger out where the sun could hear it. The sheriff shifted uneasily, torn between duty and fear, but even he couldn't quiet the tide. He rubbed a hand over his jaw and finally said, "If this town's fixing to stand against Grayson, it won't be with half measures. He owns men, guns, money enough to buy law from here to Austin. If you mean to fight him, it's all or nothing." "All or nothing," I echoed. The crowd murmured agreement. It wasn't a roar yet, but it was no longer a whisper. That night, Clara and I stayed in town. My ranch would have to wait. The saloon became our meeting place, its tables crowded not with gamblers, but with farmers, shopkeepers, widows, and drifters. Every man and woman had a story of how Grayson had bled them, stolen from them, broken them down. For years they'd carried it alone, thinking they were the only ones. Now they saw the truth. They were many, and he was one. We spoke long into the night, voices low but fierce. Plans were whispered, not of open war yet, but of standing guard, of watching the roads, of spreading word to nearby towns. Every step was dangerous, but every step was a crack in the walls of Grayson's power. When the meeting broke, I stepped outside into the cool night. The stars stretched endless above, the same stars that had watched over this land long before men like Grayson laid claim to it. Clara joined me, her face pale but her eyes alive. "You started something today," she said. I shook my head. "No, he did. I'm just the man who won't let it be buried." She smiled faintly, though there was no joy in it. "Then you better be ready, because he won't stop until one of you is in the ground." Her words lingered as the night pressed in. She was right. There was no turning back. And somewhere in the darkness beyond San Angelo, I knew Grayson was already moving his pieces. Morning broke heavy over San Angelo, though the sky was clear and the sun shone as if nothing in the world had shifted. But I felt it in my bones, the quiet before the next storm. The people had spoken in whispers and oaths the night before, but oaths mean little until tested. And Grayson was a man who tested everything. By midday, the storm arrived. The first sign was dust on the horizon, a wide plume that grew larger as the riders drew near. Folks stopped in the street, shading their eyes. Mothers pulled children close, doors slammed shut, shutters latched tight. By the time the riders reached Main Street, the town looked like it had been frozen in place. There were 15 of them, mounted on dark horses, guns gleaming in the noon sun. At their head rode a man dressed in black from hat to boots, his beard trimmed sharp, his posture proud and cold. I knew him at once, though I'd never stood close enough before to feel the weight of his presence. Grayson! He sat his horse like a king surveying conquered land, his eyes sweeping over San Angelo with a slow smile. Not the smile of a friend or neighbor, but of a wolf who'd found the sheep straying from the pen. Behind me, Clara stiffened. She stood tall despite the bruises still fading on her face, but her hands trembled where no one else could see. The sheriff came forward, trying to wear the mask of authority, but his voice cracked when he spoke. "Grayson, town wasn't expectin' visitors." Grayson's laugh was smooth, like polished steel. "Sheriff, this is my town. When I ride its streets, I don't ask permission. He dismounted then, every movement measured, deliberate. His boots hit the dirt with a sound that seemed to echo louder than it should. He strolled toward the center of the street, and his men spread out behind him, torches and rifles in hand. "Yesterday," he said, raising his voice so it carried to every corner, "some of my men went missing. I've heard rumors about prisoners, about Elias here stirring trouble, about townsfolk whispering rebellion." He turned slowly, eyes sweeping the gathered crowd. "I'm a patient man. I built my fortune on patience. But patience has its limits, and mine has run out." He snapped his fingers, and two of his men dragged someone forward from the back of the column. A man I knew, Thomas, the blacksmith's apprentice. His face was bloodied, his shirt torn. They shoved him into the dirt at Grayson's feet. The blacksmith cried out and pushed forward, but a rifle barrel to his chest stopped him cold. Grayson looked down at the boy as if he were a broken tool. This one was caught running errands for Elias, carrying word, messages, treachery. He let the words sink in, then lifted his voice again. "Let this be plain. Anyone who raises a hand against me, anyone who speaks my name with disrespect, anyone who follows this old rancher into madness, this is their fate." Before I could move, before anyone could, he drew his revolver and shot the boy where he knelt. The sound cracked through the street like thunder, and the silence that followed was worse. The blacksmith fell to his knees, clutching his apprentice's body, a wail tearing from his chest that chilled even the hardest men present. Clara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, but her eyes blazed with fury through the tears. I stepped forward then. I didn't draw my gun, not yet, but I let my voice carry. "You call yourself a man, Grayson? Shooting a boy in the street? That's not power. That's fear wearing a mask." His eyes found mine, and his smile returned, cold as a grave. "Careful, Elias. You've lived longer than most who cross me. Don't waste that miracle." I held his gaze. "You've lived too long on the backs of others. That ends." The words weren't just for him. They were for every ear straining from doorways and windows, for every heart trembling between terror and defiance. I wanted them to hear not just a challenge, but a promise. For a long moment, the street held its breath. Grayson studied me, his fingers twitching near his gun, his men tense and ready. I felt the weight of a dozen rifles aimed my way, and knew one wrong twitch would turn the street into a killing ground. But he didn't draw. Not yet. Instead, he leaned close enough that only I and Clara could hear. His voice was a hiss, slick with venom. "You've sparked something, Elias. But fire's a dangerous thing. Sooner or later, it burns everything it touches, even the fool who lit it." Then, with a gesture sharp as a whip, he mounted his horse again. His men followed, leaving the body in the street, leaving the silence behind them like a noose. When the dust settled, the townsfolk gathered, their faces pale, their eyes wide. Some were broken by what they'd seen, whispering that resistance was madness, that Grayson was too strong. But others clenched their fists tighter, their eyes burning brighter. The blacksmith stood, lifting his apprentice's body in his arms. His voice was raw, ragged, but it carried like iron. "No more," he said. "No more sons, no more daughters, no more lives stolen by that man. If Elias stands, I stand." The murmur rose again, stronger this time. Fear still clung to the edges, but anger was rising like a tide. Clara took my hand, her grip firm despite the tremor in her body. She whispered so only I could hear. "He thinks he broke them today, but all he did was show them who he really is." I nodded, though the weight on my chest grew heavier. She was right. The people were waking. But so was Grayson's wrath. The first shot had been fired. The war for San Angelo had begun. The body of young Thomas was buried at dawn, the blacksmith digging the grave with his own hands while half the town stood silent around him. The air was heavy, not only with grief but with a quiet, simmering rage. No preacher spoke, no hymns were sung. The dirt closed over him in silence, a silence that spoke louder than any sermon. Clara stood beside me, her face pale but set like stone. I could feel the weight of her hand gripping my sleeve, not out of fear, but out of resolve. "Grayson thinks he scared them yesterday," she whispered. "But he just showed them how much they've already lost. Once a man sees he's already buried too much, he stops fearing the shovel." She was right. The spark had been lit. The only question was whether it would catch into flame, or die in the wind. That evening the saloon doors swung wide again, but this time there was no laughter, no card games, no piano keys. Every table was crowded with townsfolk, ranchers, farmers, shopkeepers, even a few drifters who'd lingered longer than usual. They came not for drink, but for purpose. I stood before them, the floor creaking under my boots. Yesterday Grayson showed us his hand. He wanted to break us, to make us bow. Instead, he proved that none of us are safe as long as he holds the reins. I won't pretend this will be easy. Fighting a man like Grayson means risking everything: land, family, life itself. But if we don't stand now, we'll spend the rest of our days living on our knees. A low murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Some faces were still tight with fear, but others glowed with a new kind of fire. Clara stepped forward, her voice carrying clear. "He thought I'd stay broken, thought fear would keep me silent. But I won't be silent any more, and neither should any of you. If Elias is willing to lead, I'll stand with him." Her words struck deeper than mine could. She wasn't just a rancher's daughter anymore. She was proof of what Grayson had done, living testimony to his cruelty. And if she could stand, then who among them could refuse? That night plans began to form. The blacksmith offered his forge. "I've got scrap iron enough for blades, nails sharp as any knife. We'll need more guns, but I can see to close work." A rancher spoke up. "I've got horses, not fast enough for open war, but strong enough to haul supplies, maybe barricades." Others added what they could: dry goods, old rifles, hidden ammunition. A schoolteacher with shaking hands said she'd keep watch at night, warning if riders approached. Even the sheriff, though still pale and uncertain, muttered that he'd do what law ought to. It wasn't an army. It was farmers and widows, shopkeepers and outlaws. But it was a beginning. In the days that followed, the town changed. By day, it wore the mask of normalcy: shutters opening, trade continuing, laughter forced at the saloon. But beneath it ran a new current, a secret hum of preparation. The blacksmith's hammer rang late into the night, sparks spilling into the darkness. Old rifles were oiled and tested in barns. Barrels of water were rolled into cellars. Word was sent quiet and quick to nearby ranches and homesteads. Every man and woman who had suffered under Grayson's hand began to gather like storm clouds on the horizon. Through it all, Clara was tireless. She stitched bandages, rode with messages, spoke with those still wavering. Many who might have stayed silent found their courage in her words. She was no longer the broken girl I'd carried from the desert. She was a voice the town couldn't ignore. One night, as we sat on the porch of the saloon, watching the stars burn above, she turned to me. "Do you ever wonder if we'll live through this? I didn't lie. Every day. And still you fight." I nodded. Because there's worse than dying. Living in a world where men like him never face the reckoning they've earned. That's worse. She was quiet for a long time, then laid her head against my shoulder. Then let's make sure he faces it. But Grayson wasn't idle. Word came from travelers that he was gathering more men, pulling in hired guns from as far as Abilene and El Paso. They spoke of wagon loads of rifles, of promises of gold and land to those who rode with him. His reach was long, and his money deeper than any well. And then came the fires. One night, a ranch just outside town went up in flames. By the time anyone arrived, it was nothing but ash, the family gone without a trace. The next night, a wagon was found overturned, its driver dead in the dirt, goods stolen. Grayson's message was clear. If San Angelo would not bow, he would bleed it dry, piece by piece. The fear returned, sharp and biting. Some whispered of giving in, of bending the knee just to survive. But others clenched their jaws harder, anger building like a storm about to break. When the next meeting came, the saloon was packed tighter than ever. I stood at the center, looking at their weary, determined faces. He wants us to break, wants us to crawl. But every fire he lights only steals us more. We've prepared long enough. Soon we'll have to face him. And when we do, it won't be on his terms. It'll be ours. The blacksmith slammed a hammer down on the table, sparks flying from the forge in the corner. Then say when, Elias. Because I'm done waiting. A chorus of voices rose with his, raw and fierce. They were no longer whispers. They were ready. Clara's eyes met mine across the room, shining with fire. She didn't need to speak. I knew what she was saying. The time for preparation was ending. The time for battle was coming. The first shot of war came not at noon, not with warning, but in the dead of night. I woke to the sound of hooves and gunfire, the crack of rifles splitting the silence. By the time I pulled on my boots, the air already smelled of smoke. Clara was at my side, eyes wide but steady, a pistol clutched in her hands. Grayson had come. From the porch of the saloon I saw torches flaring like angry stars, his riders circling the town like wolves around a campfire. Shots rang out, windows shattered, doors splintered. A barn went up in flames at the edge of town, its blaze turning the sky red. But San Angelo did not cower. The blacksmith was already in the street, swinging his hammer like a war club, shouting for the townsfolk to hold their ground. Men and women spilled from their homes, rifles cracking from doorways and rooftops. For every torch Grayson's men threw, a bullet answered. Clara gripped my arm. If we let them pin us here, we're done. We need to drive them back, show them this town won't break. She was right. I called out to those nearest. Form lines. Don't scatter. Aim true, and make every shot count. The townsfolk rallied. Crates and wagons were pulled into barricades, rifles braced across them. Clara ran among the fighters, loading weapons, pressing bandages to wounds, her voice fierce and steady. Fear still hung heavy, but courage burned hotter. Through the smoke, I saw him. Grayson sat tall on his horse at the edge of town, watching the chaos with that same cold smile. He hadn't come to fight, not yet. He'd come to measure us, to see if San Angelo still had spine. I raised my rifle, drew a bead on him, finger tightening on the trigger. But he turned his horse just as I fired, the bullet striking dirt where he'd been. His laugh echoed through the night like a promise. The battle raged till dawn. By the time the sun rose, the riders had pulled back, leaving bodies in the dust and smoke curling from burned-out homes. San Angelo still stood, bloodied but unbroken. But I knew this was only the beginning. Grayson had tested us, and we had not broken, which meant the next time he came, he would come with everything. Morning light revealed the scars of the night. Blackened barns, bullet-pocked walls, blood drying in the dust. Yet for all the ruin, the people of San Angelo walked with heads higher than before. They had faced Grayson's fire and still stood breathing. That alone was victory enough to kindle hope. But hope would not be enough for what was coming. In the saloon, turned now into a war room, we spread out maps across the tables. Ranchers, farmers, the sheriff, the blacksmith, all bent over the paper, arguing lines, pointing with calloused fingers. Clara stood at my side, eyes sharp, listening to every word. "We can't wait for him to choose the ground," I said. "If he rides in with full force, this town won't hold. We meet him at the edge, funnel him, trap him where his numbers don't matter." The sheriff, pale but firmer now, nodded. "The canyon road. Narrow, easy to defend. If he wants to reach San Angelo, he'll have to ride through it." So the plan was set. The people who had once feared even speaking Grayson's name now hammered stakes, dug trenches, prepared ambush points. Wagons were rolled into place as barricades, rifles distributed, ammunition counted. Every soul had a task, even children carrying water and bandages to the ready. And we were not alone. By dusk, riders began to arrive. Ranch hands from homesteads Grayson had bled dry, old gunmen who'd once sworn never to fight again, even drifters who had no ties but hated the smell of tyranny. They came with worn rifles, scarred pistols, and hardened faces. San Angelo was no longer a lone town. It had become a rallying cry. That night, Clara stood in the street with lantern light on her face, speaking to the gathered crowd. "Grayson thinks we are broken people. Farmers, widows, shopkeepers. He thinks his money makes him untouchable. But tomorrow, when he rides, he'll learn what happens when ordinary folk decide they've bled enough. We fight not just for San Angelo, but for every voice he's tried to silence." Her words rolled like thunder across the crowd, and in their eyes I saw not fear but fire. When the cheering faded, she turned to me quietly. "Tomorrow decides everything." I looked out toward the dark horizon, where somewhere beyond the hills Grayson was gathering his army. My hand tightened on the rifle at my side. Then tomorrow it ends. The night passed restless. Horses stamped in their corrals, men and women whispered prayers, guns were cleaned and checked again and again. The air itself seemed to tremble with what was coming, and when dawn broke, the scouts rode in with dust in their throats and terror in their eyes. "They're coming," one gasped. "Dozens of them, maybe more. Grayson's bringing all he's got." Every sound in San Angelo fell silent. The moment had come. We rode out to meet it. The horizon burned first, not with sun, but with dust and the thunder of hooves. Grayson had come with everything he had, a wave of men, rifles, and torches that promised death to anyone who stood against him. I stood at the edge of the canyon road, Clara at my side, and the townsfolk arrayed behind us. Faces streaked with soot and sweat, rifles braced, hearts pounding. The air was taut, heavy with smoke, fear, and determination. "Hold your lines," I shouted. "Wait for my signal. Aim true, and remember why we fight." Clara's hand brushed my arm, steadying me. She didn't need to speak. Every glance she gave carried the unspoken words. We endure. We rise. We win. The first riders thundered into view, dust and screams mixing with the smell of sweat and gun oil. Grayson's voice carried across the canyon, mocking, sharp, cruel. "Yield, Elias. Give me the girl, and I'll spare the rest of your town." I shook my head. "Not today. Not ever." Then the fight erupted. Rifle fire cracked, bullets whistling past ears. Horses reared, men shouted, women fired from behind barricades, and Clara moved like a force of nature, loading, shooting, urging those around her. Every movement was precise, every glance calculated. Grayson's men pressed hard, but the canyon funneled them perfectly. Trenches slowed them, wagons blocked paths, and San Angelo's defenders cut down the first wave with deadly accuracy. Smoke and dust clung to the canyon like a cloak of war, visibility near zero, screams and shouts mingling in a terrifying symphony. I spotted Grayson himself, mounted on a massive black horse, his coat gleaming in the sunlight. His eyes found mine, and for a moment time slowed. All the nights of planning, all the deaths and fears, condensed into that one glare. I raised my rifle, and the world narrowed to one shot. He fired first, his revolver spitting fire. I dodged, rolled, and returned fire, hitting the horse just enough to unseat him. He hit the dirt hard, rolling to keep from breaking, but the fight in his eyes hadn't dimmed. Clara was at my side, facing down a group of men trying to flank us. She swung a rifle like a club, knocked one off his horse, shoved another into the canyon's edge, and pressed forward, fearless. I saw in her every ounce of the girl I had found broken in the stable, now transformed into a warrior who refused to be anyone's pawn. Hours passed like seconds, chaos and blood painting the canyon walls. Yet slowly, Grayson's forces faltered. His hired guns began to fall, horses screamed, men surrendered or fled, and San Angelo's defenders pushed forward with a courage born of years under his tyranny. Finally, it came down to him. Grayson, alone, cornered and breathing hard. The townsfolk had surrounded him. The blacksmith stepped forward, hammer raised, his face streaked with ash and tears. Clara walked beside me, eyes never leaving his. "You're done," I said, voice low but carrying. "No more fear. No more death. Not here. Not ever." Grayson sneered, but it was empty. The fire he'd carried into the town had been extinguished, and now his power was gone. He surrendered, dragged away by the sheriff and the townsfolk who had found their voices and their courage. The dust settled. The sun climbed over a town battered, scarred, but alive. Families embraced, tears falling freely. Clara and I stood together, surveying what had been won not through law, not through money, but through courage and unbroken will. She leaned on me, soft but steady. "We did it." I nodded, the weight of all we had endured settling into silence. "Yes, but remember, it's not just about surviving. It's about living free. That's what we've earned. San Angelo would rebuild. Lives would continue." And in the quiet after the storm, a bond had formed between us, unspoken, undeniable. The fight was over, but the story of courage and resistance would echo far longer than Grayson ever could. And as the town rose, I knew one thing with certainty. Justice, when fought with heart, always finds its way.